everybody. Thanks so much for the warm welcome so far. It's been great to get to know so many people out here and hear about the cool projects you're working on. Like we heard earlier, the hospitality of everybody here has been exceptional. And again, thank you so much to all the organizers for all the work putting this together and kind of getting everybody here to talk about what we're doing with our organizations and how we can make supporting each other easier, and also how we can build great software and bring value for our users. So this talk, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the approach that we take to reliability engineering or operations engineering to start out, and then we're going to kind of deep dive into a set of documentation that we call Runbooks. And these are very actionable checklists that help you know what procedures to follow in case something breaks. So what you sort of start out with, some of the metrics you might look at, and what operations you need to perform. And then after that, we're going to touch a little bit about, once you kind of have this written out in text that a human can read, some of the ways that you can go about converting that into something that a computer can read. So we're not going to get too much into the code because I know that that's not really what we're here, but more of the mindset of how you can kind of systematically approach structuring something to make it easy for humans and then apply that to the computers, which is pretty fun. So a little bit about myself. So I started out, my first job was in help desk at Google, and it was pretty awesome. I spent a bunch of time in Mountain View, where I was primarily based, also in the Boston office, as well as the Google Zurich office, which is pretty fun. So I got a chance to kind of experience like a global IT infrastructure, and also got to figure out how Borg was run, got to launch some systems out there with some teams for some side projects. So I really felt like it was a pretty great experience just kind of learning how global infrastructure is run. After that, I joined Twitter, where I was the first SRE for a system called Mesos, where we sort of took sort of the inspiration from Borg, and then we actually built out a very large container system. So we helped migrate Twitter's Ruby on Rails monorail, which is just one big Ruby app you may have heard about, and broke it down into a huge fleet of microservices and ran all of that on top of Aurora and Mesos. So we kind of started with a cluster that was probably about less than 100 servers, and then we grew it up to tens of thousands of machines in multiple data centers around the world. So I was really fortunate to work with a great team, learn from a lot of smart people, but it was very focused. So I didn't really have the opportunity to get the breadth of experience. So running a cluster and doing some like economics of resource management. How do we make sure we have enough CPUs for all of the systems that are running? And so I was really excited to come work at Slack, where we do have an operations team, and we're really responsible for running Slack itself. So yesterday you may have seen my teammate Guido. He's a member of the storage operations team, where he really focuses on the stateful services. And I'm a member of the application operations team. And so this is pretty much everything that's not metrics and not stateful services. So if you are having trouble connecting to Slack, or if you see that kind of yellow banner that's saying, oh, trying to reconnect, it's probably my fault. So I'm working really hard on fixing that. So hopefully that doesn't happen too often. So it's been pretty great working with the team there, and just experiencing that growth has been very interesting. So I kind of touched on this initially, but I really wanted to dig into what I consider sort of the audience of DevOps Days conferences, or SRECon, if you've been to an event like that. I think there's a lot of different approaches and a lot of different titles for what I generally view as the same thing. In this case, if you're at Facebook, maybe you think of it as production engineering. Google really pushes the site reliability engineering. And so I don't think that it necessarily matters so much what your title is. I think that at the end of the day, we all really care about making sure that we're building very strong, excellent systems. And I think that that's the important part. So everything that we do is really about keeping the system up and running so we can keep serving customers. If our site's down, then obviously people aren't going to be able to use the service, and that's like 0% value add. So to me, it's the job that we all do in this room is one of the most important. So we're going to break this talk down into 3 pieces, and we could definitely talk about any of them for hours. But we're going to focus sort of on these 3 parts, as I said. So who here considers yourself like an experienced operations engineer, like a senior engineer, something like that? You've been around for a few years, or maybe you've had a few calls in the middle of the night. No one really? Come on. Have you been on call before? Okay, awesome. Have you written, have people heard the term runbooks before? Okay, awesome. Who hasn't heard Runbooks before? Okay, food people, cool. Yeah, I was talking to some people the past few days, and I think I made some assumptions about it, so we'll go into a little bit of the description too. So we're going to kind of set the stage for what priorities and approaches we have to running a large web service, and this is kind of based on many years of doing this in a few different organizations. So primarily we're going to be talking about when you're trying to run with a team of larger groups of people. So this is where it's not just one team, but you actually have like organizations that are composed of sub-teams that all need to collaborate and work together. So the way that I kind of break down the team is there's something called the 2 pizza rule. And so this is when if you have a team offsite and everybody goes out to spend some time together, the theory is that you should be generally large enough that you can share 2 pizzas. If I was on the team, it might be the 3 pizza rule, but generally this is enough to kind of communicate. So there are a few best practices. Of course, I did not wake up thinking I was going to take the projector down, but things happen. So that's okay because we can kind of figure out how are we going to structure and inform our work based on a lot of best practices. So 3 things that I sort of look at is kind of forward thinking. So it's sort of how do we plan and structure the work that we're going into. And then there's also documentation and then also communication. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these 3. So the first one is that when you're sort of looking at how you're structuring the work, there's some of it which is, oh, this is just a very routine deploy. This is a small configuration change. It's not really something that's going to be, very stressful. Of course, we've all had that change we push out where we say, oh, this is going to be so easy, no big deal. And then we wind up taking the site down. But fortunately, those are generally pretty rare. So overall, sometimes, and then by extension, sometimes you have the very large changes. Like, hey, we're going to make this huge pivot. We're not really sure of a way to do this incrementally, so we kind of need to have a very special one-off deployment or something like that, and that's hopefully very rare. But sometimes we need to take a little bit more time to recognize, hey, we need to slow down here. We do want to say, hey, maybe take the whole week to focus on this. Give somebody the chance to whiteboard it with a few different people. And I think that's really going to be valuable when you have something that's a little bit more intensive. Is everyone familiar with rollback strategies as well? There's generally a concept where if you push out a change, sometimes people say, oh, well, if we push something out, then it's very easy just to roll it back and kind of go back the other way. So if you say, hey, we're going to try out this new load balancer, it's going to be great. Sometimes when you say, okay, well, if it's not working, traffic success rate is dropping, all we're going to do is we're going to switch back to the other way. Sometimes that doesn't actually work out too well if sometimes maybe the traffic pattern has changed or maybe there were some increased errors and clients have started entering like a retry loop. Maybe switching back to the old load balancer, now it may not be able to handle the increased load because more clients are trying to connect in what's called a stampeding herd. And so we've actually found that sometimes a rollback strategy is not very safe. So in that case, you may need to put a little bit of extra time into communicating something more extensive, so kind of having a plan B. So thinking through, hey, if we do make this change, what is our backup plan? So making sure you do understand, it may not be as simple as just pointing back to the other load balancer, but maybe having, maybe increasing the capacity for the original one, considering some way of saying, how do we shed some load or how do we redirect people to a different region? So not just planning out the change that you're actually making, but planning out a backup plan as well is very critical. This could also be something like a feature flag approach. So you could say, instead of pushing everybody all at once to one load balancer, instead you could say, hey, let's, in the code, when we hand people DNS resolution or when we hand people a URL that they need to connect to, instead we could say, let's only point 5% of users to this new load balancer. And then you can change that configuration over time to go to 10%, 25%, 50%, and then you don't have this huge change. You're able to do this more incrementally, which can help. And then lastly, one aspect of planning which is helpful is making sure that as much as possible, your deploy strategy for actually pushing an initial change out is going to be the same as your rollback strategy. So if you do have some way of saying, hey, we're going to push out this version of the code, and then maybe we already have the rollback version ready to go, make sure that the way that you actually push out that first version is the same as your rollback. Because sometimes it's, oh, we're going to do this special, SSH into the machines, and we're going to copy something from S3, which is different from the normal process. Sometimes this can be difficult because you don't actually test it as frequent as your normal procedure. So making sure that these are one and the same is generally quite important to make sure nothing's going to break in the meantime. So this is going to be, so this here is more about sort of the text that's written in the past and consumed in the present. So this is something where you take some time, you just finished a big project, or maybe you're in the middle of a project, and you're going to put down what is hopefully very fresh in your brain, you've just completed something, and you're going to put it down somewhere where your teammates or your future self can see it. And then maybe 2 months from now, next week, a year from now, you're going to be able to come back to this and say, okay, well, what was the state of things at this time? And we've actually found that this is something that's been difficult to do unless we make this a little bit more structured for us and make sure that we actually bake this into our planning and make sure that people do have the time to say, hey, I know I just finished this previous project, and I know I have something coming up, and this team needs this, delivered quickly. But I'm going to take an extra, hour or extra day, and I'm going to sort of carve this out. Even put something on my calendar to set the time aside to make sure that I take what's up here and put it down into some text for, the rest of my team to understand. So in this case, this is definitely something where everybody here in this room, we can work with our teammates to make sure that we have enough time to do this. This is not something which, this is being used in the future. I think it makes it really easy for people to say, oh, this isn't that helpful. We don't need this now. It's not going to, bring too much value to us. This is something which has delayed benefits. And so sometimes it can be difficult to justify it when you have a team that needs something else done right away. But this is definitely something that we can all go back to our teams and make sure that we build that time for each other.
I have a question.
Yeah, of course.
Other than...
Sure. So I think the question is, what value could additional documentation than just Jira bring? So sometimes we've actually found that sometimes Jira can be a little bit cluttered over time. So sometimes it can be like the comment thread in a ticketing system can sometimes have multiple approaches. It can be a little bit more task-oriented, sort of, here's my project for today. Oh, I'm going to be on vacation for a few weeks, so I'm not going to get onto this for a bit. And so sometimes it can be more of like a long story, sort of like a Lord of the Rings tale of getting to Mordor. And documentation is supposed to be a little bit more of a full, complete snapshot in time, and so it's supposed to be a little bit more structured. We're going to talk a little bit more about the runbook documentation, but I think one example would be a design document, which typically is written a little bit before the project is completed and then updated after it's done to reflect the true state. But this is something where somebody very new to the team or very new to the company can say, hey, I've heard about this cool system. What does this do? What's the point of this? What's its goal? And what are the pieces that make up this system? And I think that that's something that can be a little bit easier and more cohesive than something that's just a bunch of comments all strung together. But that's a really good question. Does that answer your... Cool. All right. So now, obviously working at Slack, I think communication is important. There's a few different ways to do this, but this part is much more real time. So this is something where you're going to actually be having a conversation with somebody. When the information is generated, it's the same time that it's actually consumed by your teammate. Or if you have some sort of bot that's writing something in a channel, you're going to be reading this and taking advantage of it, understanding and acting on it. So this is something where we found that this is very immediate and very direct, but it also has a very high cost. So this is something where, if you get paged in the middle of the night and you have to respond to an incident, this is something where the only way that this is going to be helpful to you is if your teammate is also awake at the time. So if, the benefit of documentation is that if it's well written and helpful and very clear, that you don't need to worry about having somebody else there. Someone's already taken the time in the morning, they had their coffee, they wrote their documentation. This means that somebody needs to actually be there with you, giving you attention and understanding what you're asking, and then putting it there in real time for you to understand how to deal with it. So one of the most important things that we've actually found is kind of communicating how do we describe some of the changes we've made to our system. Guido kind of discussed it yesterday because we have a global team around the world in San Francisco, Dublin, and Melbourne. And so for us in particular, it's very important because we don't just have people in one time zone. And so it's not as easy to go out with the team for lunch, kind of, oh, what are you working on? How are things going? Because there's going to be people who are going to be working when you're sleeping. And so we need to make sure that sometimes we keep this real-time log, which then eventually becomes documentation because you've written what you're doing in channel, and then they can go back later and see what's going on. One other thing that we've actually pushed a lot, which has helped us, is when we are either making a description in a code review or we are trying to update something in a ticketing system, we do try to cross-link between things, which has actually been very, very helpful. A lot of the times we have PRs which go out and they're saying, oh, we just fixed this thing or we increased the RAM limit on this. And it's a little bit difficult to understand, 6 months from now, why did we bump the RAM? It turned out doing that exhausted the resources on the box, and now we're running into limits in some other components. And it can be pretty difficult to sort of search back through history sometimes, as opposed to just posting that quick link to the Slack thread or to the ticket, and then you can go through and see, oh, let's see the discussion. Somebody got paged. They needed to figure out what was going on. We had the killer kicked in. So making it easy for the future is helpful as well. So we talked about these 3 components. Obviously, the ideal is you sort of structure things in this way, but as we heard in the talk previously, this isn't always the case. Things aren't always this glorious. So, of course, things get more difficult over time. You sort of have more people, more locations. Sometimes you have people leave that have a lot of understanding and a lot of context, and then you have new people that join the team that don't understand how this happens. So these are just some of the edge cases that you might run into. And again, I think that this is something where having good documentation can really help. If you realize that you have only one superstar on the team who has a lot of that context in their head and they're not present, maybe they're finally taking that vacation they should have done 4 years ago, and they're not around, all of a sudden the whole company is held hostage because you're not able to get information from them. And so that's why I think really putting in the time, maybe even creating a separate Jira ticket for documentation is going to be really helpful. But I think the thing that's important to remember is that when you do have these issues, this generally is a good thing. If you do have more than just that one person who knows everything, that means that you have a larger team. You have more people that can work on improving your infrastructure. You have more people that can pair and ask questions and come up with new ideas. And this is actually awesome because this means that you're doing something that your customers are enjoying, and there are more people that are trying to come and take advantage of the value that you're bringing, which is really important. So here's where we get to what I think is the really fun part of this talk. So I've been on a team previously where our runbook was just one really long wiki page. And it was actually kind of difficult to find out what was going on because Command F or Control F and try and find some of the keywords you're looking for. And you get like 17 hits on the page. And it was very difficult to say, okay, well, do I follow this thing? Or maybe this change, this looks like it was last edited like 4 months ago. Is it still valid? Oh, this was just a formatting change, so the content's the same. And so for us, it was actually occasionally very difficult because we didn't really have much of a structure. So we sort of said, hey, we have a runbook, and we're just going to keep adding to the same page. And it sort of worked out initially, but over time, as the system grew more complex, it was very difficult to deal with, which was unfortunate. So I'm a little biased, but I think the current approach is a little bit better. It's mainly thanks to our visibility team, headed up by our teammate Megan, and she did an awesome job of coming up with a good structure, and I think it's actually been pretty successful. So even if you don't follow anything else I suggest here, I think making the time for this would be really great. So I think the first thing you're going to do is kind of consider if the documentation that you're writing is actually really a runbook. So if you're kind of documenting an architecture or a workflow that's sort of expected to become muscle memory, so something like how Logstash works, or maybe what's the workflow for committing a change to Chef, then probably this documentation belongs in like a larger like design doc directory. So runbooks are for repeatable processes. So we're all required to refer to the runbook each and every time we execute a process documented so that the changes in runbooks will reliably take effect. So this is pretty important because every time we need to maybe spin up a new service, or we need to, we do still have a few sort of like pet servers. Every time we do need to work on some of these, we need to make sure that we go back to the runbooks, because one of our teammates may have just finished working on one of them, updating something, modifying the way the database is provisioned that's attached to that service, and we need to make sure that we're following the latest steps. Otherwise, the service comes up and may not be set up correctly. So again, this is something where it's built into our culture that we're always going to be checking this first, giving it that glance, checking when the file was last modified, and making sure that we're okay with the steps as they're written. And if not, we know who to talk to because it's going to be listed who edited the page. So there's sort of three components to how we sort of structure these things. The first one is, where do you locate this information? There's a few different options. The second is the format and kind of how you lay it out. And then the third is going to be the contents. So what's actually inside of this? So what are you going to see and use here? So there are a few different, like I said, a few different options. One of these that I've seen some teams use is Google Docs. And this generally can work out okay. Google obviously it's good with that search thing, I think. You have access to mobile apps. So sometimes if you're at dinner, your laptop's in your bag and you're waiting for it to come on, you can jump on ahead of time on the mobile app, open it up, and get the access to the information very quickly, which is pretty nice. So this is something that can be pretty helpful. I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is an external service. So you're relying on Google's uptime, which generally is pretty good. But this is something where it is a little bit of a black box. If Google Docs has an outage at the same time that you do, it's not something that you're going to be able to deal with. You just have to trust Google to get up and keep that service running, which, again, for the teams I know that have used it, has been working out pretty well for them. Another option, and again, sort of what we used in a previous team, was a web-based wiki that was hosted internally. We found this to work out pretty well for us. Again, we sort of got a little bit more functionality. It was being hosted internally. We were able to make sure that it was all the data was stored within our data centers, which at the time I think was important to us. Now less so. But I think it was a little bit difficult to make sure that, whenever you were making the changes, you'd need to be VPN'd in or something like that. So you didn't have that easy access, which was not as nice. And then also the text editor that was built in was a little bit difficult to use. What we're using is Markdown files in Git, and we're actually using GitHub's web UI just to display this. It's sort of nice because you still have the same tools that you would use when you're like grepping through source code. You're able to use the same, git grep workflow as you would on your documentation as well. GitHub also does obviously have search functionality built into the repositories, which is nice. And you do have the normal like PR workflow. So something that I typically do is after I'm making a bunch of changes, I'll send it over to the teammate that I've paired up with and said, hey, here's what I think is going to be good. Does this seem like it makes sense to you? And I guarantee you 9 times out of 10, they're like, Joe, I have no idea what any of this means. Like, I know that all these words make sense to you, but I don't know what any of this is. And so it's actually a great step to kind of get that validation ahead of time, not at 2 a.m., to make sure that somebody else understands it. And it's written in a manner that's very clear. So there's no, any terms that need to be defined ahead of time are going to be written up very clearly, and there's not going to be some surprise like, oh, just, tab the bobble or something, and people are like, I don't know what a bobble is, how does this work? So I think that's pretty helpful. And then one last thing that's actually has been quite helpful for us. We do use GitHub Enterprise, and I think some of our use cases are a little bit unique, and so sometimes we do need to make sure that we're able to restore GitHub Enterprise in case there are any issues with it. And fortunately, people do have a local copy of the repository on their laptops and on some of the Bastion servers that we use. So this has been pretty nice just to make sure that no matter what happens, there's several copies of this as well. So you kind of get built-in federation, all the benefits of Git, and so you don't need to worry about that, which is cool. So here's sort of a general structure that we've seen. Again, thanks to Megan for really iterating on this and coming up with it. So runbooks need to be organized into directories, and so we have like a big top-level documentation repo, and inside of that is a runbooks directory. And all of these should be named sort of descriptively and sort of broadly. So for instance, we have a system called the message server for sending messages, and that's a top-level directory, and that's going to have some descriptive files located within it. So within those files, there's like a first-level heading that matches the name of the file, and then also sort of second-level headings, which we'll see in a moment. So we're going to kind of walk through each of these files, which I think will be a little bit easier to do that. So this one here is the README is kind of the main page when somebody first goes in here. This is going to be, the basic explanation of the service, some of the related services which someone might need to know, either upstream or downstream. There's also going to be contacts or channels for that service, and then maybe any links or graphs that might be helpful. So usually each service is going to have a corresponding Grafana page, and this is a perfect place to say, hey, if you wanted to generally see the overview, click on this, it's going to take you right to the dashboard. So this is going to be the window into the service for somebody that is just joining the team. Hey, what are the things we're responsible for? Let me take a look at the runbook and kind of get the lay of the land. And context is also very important because sometimes it's going to be something where somebody is very confused. They need to figure out who owns this and how do I get in contact with them. And this is something which we're able to keep up to date, which is good. So this one here is fortunately going away. There's this thing called an Autoscaling Group, which took us a little bit of time to appreciate, but fortunately, anytime there are some of these, again, special one-off servers, this would be where these steps are located. Each process documented should present as pros, any context that might be required to decide if people actually need to use this runbook in particular. So usually for us, we'll get a request like, hey, we need to, get a new backend service for this thing. We would know that this is where provisioning instructions would be for this. And one other thing that we found very helpful is making sure that the Markdown is used quite precisely. So this means that if you do have some text that needs to be copy pasted into the terminal, some commands that need to be run, make sure you're using either backticks or the triple backticks to create a code block, because in the heat of the moment, consistent formatting is going to help add clarity and help us move quickly and confidently. So definitely if when I first started, I had some decent Markdown experience, but it's definitely something where I definitely took a look at the documentation again, made sure I was familiar, and then also was able to look at some of the other runbooks to sort of make sure that we had a consistent style. So this was something that really helped as well. So this one I think is the most actionable for, and probably the most important because I use these pages 90% of the time. This is where when you get the page and you say, what the heck does this mean? I don't know what this service is. I don't remember what's going on. Our CDN is down. That sounds bad. What does that mean? So usually we have a post in Slack, and it kind of gives you a little bit of context, maybe a linked graph, and then also a link to the corresponding runbook as well. And so that'll take you directly to this page, which matches to this location, which matches the page that you just received. And sort of the first thing I do, we use PagerDuty. First thing we do, we click through, acknowledge the page, and then we go into Slack, look at the alert in the channel, which is in our alerts channel, and then we click through to get to this page. And to be honest, usually it's on my phone, which I'm taking advantage of GitHub's mobile formatting. And this is where I think for me, impact is actually quite critical because some pages are whatever you're doing, walk out of the meeting, get back to your desk and take a look. And sometimes it's, hey, if you need 5 minutes, that's okay, but you really should take a look at this now. So it's sort of the difference between the service is down for everyone and this is something that needs to be taken care of during business hours or something like that. And again, the insight is any more dashboards might be specific to this problem in particular. So sometimes an alert could not just be for one particular service, but maybe have issues with upstream or downstream services. And that means that you need to take a look at those as well to see maybe where you can pinpoint the problem.
How do you correlate between?
So the question is, how do we correlate between PagerDuty and the runbooks? So when we use Chef to, a little helper that we wrote in Chef repo to create our alerts in Isinga. And when they fire, they actually do two things. The first is they send a page with the API for PagerDuty, and then they also use Slack's API to post a message in channel. And so then we format the message. When we're configuring it, we configure the URL for the page as well. So making sure that matches is important. So the question is there like a wildcard or some special redirection that happens? We don't in particular, but I could see there being some, service which maybe parses the alert and then actually does a redirect, like sends a 301. So something like that could definitely be doable. So that'd be pretty cool, actually. Awesome. Did that answer your question? Cool. Any other questions?
How do you keep the documentation up to date?
How do you keep the documentation up to date is like the number one question of all time. I don't want to say that we have like the magic answer, unfortunately. I think it was 2 weeks ago or something, I was looking at some alert, and I was like, none of this is valid anymore. Like, definitely we did not update this after we made this change. And so I think that's where, fortunately that's rare-ish, but I think, I don't want to say shame your teammates into updating the docs, but that was definitely something where, so I was actually working in Dublin, in our Dublin office at the time, and so I definitely paged my teammates in San Francisco and said, hey, you happen to be the one working on this, and I don't remember what the steps were. I searched through Slack and I couldn't find anything about this. What should we do here? And so, we were able to solve the problem. We got things back up and running. And then the next day, of course, my teammate was like, oh, here's the review for the alert update. What do you think about this? So I think this is something where, if we don't hold ourselves accountable when we're working on the projects to actually update the documentation, I think we need to hold each other accountable. And so for me personally, I think it's one thing to say, hey, you should update the alert, but I think it's another when somebody pages you for something and then you say, hey, I don't want to get woken up again. I'm going to make sure I update that. So not that I take evil glee in paging my teammates, but maybe a little bit. So yeah, it's okay. So I think a little bit of that motivation helps, but generally we try to help each other and make sure we don't need to do that. So that's where I think carving out that time for documentation in particular is very important.
But other than that, do you have any tips or parts of the workflow that help you with that? For example, when someone checks in code, do they also get a review of the documentation, something like that?
Yeah, so I think I think that for us, because we do require peer review for all changes, all code changes, I think that's generally the process where when somebody's reviewing something, if they don't have context on what this change means or how this works, they're going to be like, hey, I don't know what this is. It's part of the, I think it's part of the code reviewer's responsibility and something that they're paying attention to say, hey, I realize that you're making this change. I kind of get it, but I don't 100% understand. I need to see a little bit more documentation about what's happening. And so I think that's something that that we've actually found is caught in code review. If the documentation isn't updated, then people that review aren't going to have the context. And so for us, that's been something where it's been helpful. We haven't created something that parses a change to a certain cookbook and then checks to see if there's corresponding PR in documentation. I think that's also super interesting, but yeah, I think that might be a little bit difficult to make sure there's it's not too noisy or too blocking. But yeah, something like that could be awesome. So also, one thing that's we found that is very important is don't just say run this command, but you should mention where should you run the command from in some cases. So sometimes there's actually a orchestration host or some centralized staging server or something, and the command actually needs to be run there and not on the box that's having the issue. And so I think it's super critical to make sure that you don't just say oh, run this command, but where to run that from, and being very explicit, SSH this machine, or go to this page and click on this button, or check this graph. It's not just execute this process. Another thing is, again, making sure that you have links to graphs and things like that, particularly to show, a really great runbook is going to have the graph that says, click here, fill in, whichever host or service maybe are templated. And so then you can actually see, the huge drop, which shows the problem, and then hopefully you can also see a corresponding graph, which after you fix it will show the improvement and the success rate climbing again. So making sure that that's the kind of graph you're looking for shows that your alert and your metrics are probably tuned well enough. And then lastly, make sure that you're also including any ancillary actions. So we have status.slack.com, and for certain alerts, again, these ones that are very critical, that means that okay, if you're getting this, that means people cannot connect to Slack and aren't able to get their work done. So that means one of the first things we're going to do, step number one, is go into our incidents channel, talk to our customer experience team, and ask them to update the status site because there's an outage, and we're going to be looking into fixing it. So definitely making sure that you're explicitly listing out not just the technical steps, but the organizational workflow as well. Very important. So again, fortunately, this page, I mention it here because we do have some pets and not everything's in an Autoscaling group, but this is something which you need to make sure that if you do have some system, this is something that we've had more of that we don't really use as much anymore. And this is maybe, so this is an example that I think is maybe not the best, and so that's kind of why I picked it out. So this is something that I used, which wasn't really helpful. This is an alert page for us where when our web servers have too many of the child processes are locked up and they're not being responsive. This is what you're going to get, and unfortunately, this alert isn't the best because it actually means that there's some other part of the system which is probably having a problem. So this is probably Apache is waiting on MySQL. Maybe somebody deployed a change. We have some really tight loop which is iterating over all the members of a team, and we're trying to fetch too much from the database at once. So basically, the point of this alert. A point of this documentation is actually to point people to downstream services and say, hey, if you're getting this, we know that this might look like an Apache web server problem, but it's probably one of the downstream services. So one thing that this doesn't do is it actually doesn't link to corresponding runbooks. So this would be very helpful to say, hey, we've seen in the past that this is an issue with this, MySQL thread exhaustion or something. And so linking to other runbooks would actually be very helpful. So this is something where, it has been improved over time, but I think this is an example of where it isn't even actually, it's telling you to do something, but it's not leading you to that point. So then person at 2 a.m. just needs to follow through with this. So an experienced team member would be able to read this and have no problem saying, oh yeah, I know where the MySQL page is and how to get there. But someone new on the team is going to burn some time trying to figure out where do I go to understand this. And again, as we mentioned, design documentation is sort of the overall overview and layout. And these are checklists for actually running the services that you're dealing with. So here's kind of my favorite part, and I realize I'm a little slow, so I'm going to speed up a bit. So we're going to talk about one of my favorite maxims, and then an ancient proverb. So this is from the JUnit FAQ where I first saw it. I believe this came from somewhere else, but this is where I've always sort of turned to it. So when it comes to unit testing or load testing your service, I find that this is actually very, very helpful because I think there's a lot of times where I'm really concerned about pushing something into production, and that usually means that I need to remove some of that fear. So I think the opposite part of that, it's kind of a little inverse. And I think that when you actually have a very new process, maybe you're looking at it, you're not so sure what the steps are. You sort of have the theory of it, but not actually the practice. And I think that once you've sort of done something enough that you say, I don't understand why I keep doing this, that's probably the best sign that it's time for you to start writing some code to take that process and put it into something that's going to happen automatically. So it's something that's so standard, you can handle it. And even if you've seen some edge cases, you know how to handle those as well. So what's really nice about this is that a lot of times when you have the runbooks, and especially for a complex system, you're going to have a few cases where you say, hey, check this graph, but also check these 4 graphs because maybe it's a MySQL issue, maybe it's the cache is having a problem, maybe this is going on. And so it turns into this very difficult kind of the data is everywhere, you're in the matrix and you're looking at all these graphs, and it can be really tough to sort of automatically understand, okay, well, if all of these things are true, but this service is okay, but then this one has like tons of load issues, then that probably means that this downstream is the issue. And so when you write code, you can actually have something that's going to query your, maybe graphite metrics backend, and it can actually do some of that calculations for you. And so it can actually check and see, hey, if these metrics are all at above 95%, but this one all of a sudden took a sharp dive below 70, then this is probably the procedure to follow. And so you can codify that in code and write the conditionals and the if statements, and then actually operate in that regard as opposed to kind of relying on the human to do all of that. So even if you write a tool to operate on one system, you can automatically query health metrics for downstream services. So generally the workflow that we've sort of seen kind of happen again and again is that somebody works on a project, they build out a service, and they're the only ones that sort of know how it works. After that, hopefully they're completing the process by actually communicating that and putting it into a runbook and documentation. And over time, maybe there's something that we sort of need to repeatedly do to repair the service. And maybe there's some small part of it where it's you need to SSH to this service, grep through the config, curl an endpoint, parse some JSON, pull something else out. And that's a little bit difficult. And so sometimes you can just write, maybe the curl, pipe it into grep, in JQ, and maybe make sure that, what used to be like 17 steps, you can start breaking it down into something very small. You're like, I hate SSHing this box, curling, piping into JQ, putting into a file. Taking something very small and simple and starting there and using that as sort of your pivot point into the script is something that we've repeatedly done again and again. And even somebody very new on the team, we've usually found these are great starter projects. So we've actually been able to look at Runbooks, say, hey, you know how we just made you do this thing? Like your first real task is actually automating that part of it, which has been nice. So over time, you have this little script. Maybe you kind of add on to it a little bit. There's going to be some problems. What used to be like a human being able to understand and fix things on the fly, now you're going to need to write the code to fix things, which is sort of tough. But overall, as you keep adding to this script in this tool, you can continue to update the documentation and say, hey, just run this script instead of these like 5 commands, just run this script instead, which is sort of nice. And over time, as you continue to expand it out, you're just going to be able to run one tool or maybe automatically have the tool be executed, and you're not going to have to do this anymore. So I think that I was talking to my teammate about this, and I think this was pretty good. So this is my buddy Aaron. He works down in Los Angeles. But he was telling me that this was when he was really frustrated. He said he didn't want to be doing this anymore. He wanted to make sure that we could write automation to do this. And we realized that since we defined the logic for something in prose and we'd sort of written it out, we could pick what language to write that out in. And it could be something that a computer can understand. So humans can also read code, but machines can explicitly use those instructions to execute things. So this is sort of the general workflow that we've seen. So somebody has in their head, they write it out into prose in text in a runbook. That's when you start to say hey, I don't want to curl this endpoint anymore and pipe it in JQ. You can write a small Python script or a little Go script to do this. And then over time you realize but there's an edge case. What if the curl, if the request.get fails, I need to retry. What if the system's down? How do I detect that and then execute a reprovision or something? And then over time, you eventually have this tool which can be run automatically. Unfortunately, if we keep doing this, it turns out we spend a lot more time working on more interesting problems and not just dealing with these sort of lower level problems as well, which is pretty nice. Especially once you get down to 5 and 6, you're not really getting woken up again and again having to deal with the same problem. So I think that we found that there's a lot of libraries out there that we can use. Definitely after the talk over lunch, I'd be happy to talk more about some of the examples that we have. It can be a little bit slow going when you're using code and testing it all and making it work, but we've definitely found that it's worth it, which has been awesome. So thanks so much, everybody. Hopefully motivated you to invest in Runbooks, which has been awesome.